یه عده آدم تهدید شده مزدور دشمن.
What is happening in Iran might not stay in Iran. This is not just another protest. This is not just another Middle East crisis. Because when a regime starts to crack from the top, when elites quietly pack their bags, when police stop enforcing order, people do not wait, they move. And when they move, Europe, at first glance, this looks familiar. Crowds, chants, burning slogans. A regime once again facing anger in the streets. But this time, the danger is not where cameras usually point. It is not the students. It is not the poor neighborhoods. It is not even the protesters themselves. The real shift is happening quietly, behind closed doors. Across Iran, protests have spread far beyond the capital. What began as economic frustration in Tehran's Grand Bazaar has moved outward, connecting cities that rarely move in unison. From the northeast to the southern ports, from industrial towns to strategic border regions, unrest is no longer isolated. It is synchronized. That alone would worry any government, but what follows worries regimes far more. Because alongside the protests, something else is breaking: discipline. Reports are emerging of police stations being abandoned, officers removing uniforms, security personnel choosing to disappear rather than confront crowds. This is not mass defection yet, but it is hesitation. And hesitation inside a coercive system is a crack that spreads fast. Authoritarian states do not collapse when people protest. They survive protests all the time. They collapse when the people ordered to suppress those protests start asking a quiet question: who will protect us when this is over? That question is now circulating inside Iran's security structure. At the same time, an even more sensitive rupture is appearing. Voices from within the religious establishment itself. Clerics openly criticizing the system. Some even attacking the very legitimacy of the leadership. In a political order built on religious authority, this is not dissent. It is heresy. And once heresy enters the system, fear changes sides. When sacred authority fractures, loyalty becomes optional. And this is where the pattern turns dangerous. Because as loyalty weakens at the bottom, movement begins at the top. In Tehran's wealthiest neighborhoods, a different kind of preparation is underway. Not for resistance, not for reform, but for exit. Reports, unconfirmed but persistent, suggest that families linked to senior political figures are seeking visas. France. Quiet destinations, places far from slogans and street fires. This is not unusual behavior for elites in crisis, but it is always revealing. Because elites do not leave when they believe the system will survive. They leave when they believe time is running out. History repeats this lesson relentlessly. When insiders begin to hedge, when relatives are moved abroad just in case, when escape routes are tested quietly, a message spreads through society faster than any speech. The people at the top are no longer confident, and confidence is the true currency of power. As this perception takes hold, something else changes. Protest becomes calculation. Leaving becomes rational. This is the point where a domestic crisis becomes a regional one. Iran is not a failed state. It is not a collapsed society. It is a deeply rooted civilization with a highly educated population and a strong sense of identity. But it is also a country under enormous economic pressure. Inflation has hollowed out wages. Basic goods have become symbols of humiliation. For many young professionals, hope has narrowed to a single question: stay and suffocate, or leave and breathe. This is where Europe enters the story, whether it wants to or not. Iran does not border Europe, but geography does not stop migration. Pathways do, and every major movement westward passes through one unavoidable corridor: Turkey. For Iranians who decide they have no future at home, Turkey is not the destination. It is the bridge, a place to regroup, to wait, to plan the next step. Beyond that bridge lies Europe. This is not speculation. It is a route shaped by decades of movement, policy gaps, and human desperation. Europe has seen this movie before. It never starts with an announcement. It starts with silence, with individual decisions, with families selling property quietly, with students choosing not to return, with professionals applying just in case. By the time governments notice, the movement is already underway. What makes Iran different is not only numbers, it is composition. Those most ready to leave are not the poorest. They are the most mobile, the educated, the skilled, the ones who can navigate borders and systems. This is not yet a wave, but it is the front edge of one. And once that edge hardens into momentum, it does not ask permission. What turns quiet dissatisfaction into movement is not ideology, it is survival. Iran's economy has been eroding for years, but what is happening now feels different on the ground. Inflation is no longer an abstract number. It is measured in meals skipped, in wages that collapse between paychecks, in shelves that stay full but feel unreachable. When basic food becomes a calculation, loyalty dissolves fast. This is why recent scenes matter more than slogans. People are not just protesting policy. They are rejecting a system they no longer believe can feed them. In several cities, anger has moved from the streets into everyday life. Supermarkets linked to regime institutions are stormed not to steal, but to humiliate the symbols of control. Rice is scattered, not taken. Food becomes a message, a public rejection of an order that demands obedience while offering scarcity. This is the moment when a crisis stops being political and becomes existential, and existential crises travel. What follows next is almost always the same sequence. First, students begin looking outward. Education becomes an exit strategy. Then professionals follow. Doctors, engineers, IT specialists, people who understand that borders are obstacles, not walls. Data from recent years already shows this trend accelerating. Millions of Iranians live abroad. A majority of those who left have no intention of returning. Tens of thousands apply for asylum every year, even without open civil conflict. Hundreds of thousands more leave through legal channels, blending into migration statistics that rarely make headlines. This happened before the current unrest escalated. That detail matters. Because crises do not create migration from nothing. They unlock what was already building. Now consider what changes when fear spreads inside the state itself. Security forces are the backbone of control. But control depends on trust flowing downward. Orders are followed because protection is expected in return. When rumors circulate that political elites are preparing escape plans, the trust collapses. No officer wants to be the last man standing for a system whose leaders are already packing. This creates paralysis. Police hesitate. Units delay. Command chains stretch. And every moment of hesitation becomes visible to the population. Fear switches sides. As this happens, the idea of leaving transforms from betrayal into logic. Families begin to ask, not should we leave, but when. This is where migration shifts from individual decisions to shared momentum. Iran's geography accelerates this process. Western regions close to the border become pressure points. Towns near transit routes turn into waiting rooms. Information spreads faster than any official statement. Which crossings are watched? Which routes still work? Which countries are granting visas quietly? And again, the same corridor appears. Turkey. Not because it promises safety, but because it promises passage. For many Iranians, Turkey represents proximity without finality, a place to step out of immediate danger without committing to permanent exile. A pause before the longer journey west. From there, the map opens. Europe is not a destination for everyone, but it remains the gravitational center. Economic opportunity, political stability, legal protection. Even for those who do not plan to stay, Europe is the endpoint of hope. This is why European policymakers follow Iran closely, even when they speak cautiously in public. They understand that migration waves do not announce themselves. They form silently and break suddenly. What makes this scenario particularly sensitive is its demographic profile. This is not a movement dominated by the very poor. It is driven by the educated middle class, people with language skills, with degrees, with networks abroad. In other words, people who move efficiently. This creates a paradox for Europe. On one hand, these migrants integrate faster. They work. They contribute. On the other, large numbers arriving quickly strain systems that are already politically fragile. Migration debates across Europe are no longer about capacity alone. They are about identity, trust, and control. Governments remember how fast the situation spiraled in the past, how quickly domestic politics radicalized, how migration became the fault line exploited by extremes. This memory shapes silence. Europe does not need to declare panic. The fear already exists. And as Iran's internal crisis deepens, one question begins to circulate quietly across ministries and border agencies. What happens if this does not stop? Because if the current pressure continues, Iran's migration profile may change again, not gradually, but abruptly. History suggests that when elites begin to leave and security forces hesitate, societies reach a tipping point. After that, movement accelerates beyond anyone's ability to manage it cleanly. This is why the situation matters now, not later. The window between contained unrest and regional consequence is often measured in weeks, not years. And as that window narrows, attention shifts to the one variable no one can fully predict: what the armed institutions will do when loyalty collapses at the top. At the center of every regime collapse lies one unanswered question: who still holds the guns? When political leadership begins to hesitate, when elites prepare exit strategies, the burden of survival shifts downward. It lands on the armed institutions, the police, the intelligence services, the army. History is unforgiving on this point. When leaders plan escape, soldiers do not fight for them. They fight for order, or they refuse to fight at all. This is where the Iranian crisis enters its most dangerous phase. The loyalty gap between senior commanders and lower-ranking officers is widening. Generals who benefited from the system for decades face soldiers whose salaries no longer cover basic food. Families of officers wait in line for rice while rumors circulate that political elites are negotiating immunity or exile. Trust collapses faster than ideology. Chains of command do not break with announcements. They break with whispers. When barracks hear that leaders are dreaming of safe landings abroad, no uniformed man wants to be the last shield for a collapsing order. This creates two possible outcomes. Both are destabilizing. Either the armed institutions fragment and evaporate, leaving a vacuum, or they intervene to secure the state while abandoning the regime. Neither outcome guarantees stability, but both guarantee movement, because moments of uncertainty produce the same response among civilians. People do not wait for clarity. They move before borders close, before routes harden, before opportunities disappear. This is how migration waves begin. Not with chaos, with calculation. Iran's population understands this logic well. Many have already tested the system. Legal exits, educational pathways, temporary visas, illegal crossings. The infrastructure of departure exists. What has been missing until now is momentum. Momentum is created by fear at the top, and as pressure builds, all roads lead west. Not immediately, not uniformly, but inevitably, once again, Turkey becomes the staging ground, a waiting room between danger and destination, a place where thousands pause, assess, and decide whether to continue. Beyond that pause lies Europe. Europe does not need to be named in Tehran for it to feel the consequences. It only needs time. European governments know this pattern. They have lived it before. They know that by the time official statements become urgent, movement has already begun. That borders do not react faster than human fear. That domestic political systems absorb shock poorly. This is why silence surrounds the Iranian question, not because the risk is small, but because it is uncomfortable. An Iranian collapse would not look like a sudden flood. It would arrive in waves. First students, then professionals, then families, then those who can no longer afford to wait. This is not about panic. It is about arithmetic. When hope disappears faster than repression can restore it, people leave, and once leaving becomes the dominant survival strategy, regimes lose leverage. They can punish protesters. They cannot punish absence. The irony is impossible to ignore. A system built on the promise of resisting the West now risks exporting its most talented citizens to it. Irony: doctors, engineers, scientists, people who no longer want to fight for reform or revolution, people who simply want air. This is why what is happening in Iran matters far beyond its borders. Not because collapse is guaranteed, but because the conditions for irreversible movement are forming. The suitcases may not yet be visible at scale, but the decision-making has already begun. And history shows that when that line is crossed, it is rarely uncrossed. So the real question is no longer whether Iran can suppress the streets. The question is this: when elites prepare to flee, when loyalty erodes, and when people stop believing tomorrow will be better than today, who stays behind to defend the system? And more importantly for Europe, if the doors open even partially, is Europe ready for what comes next? Let us know what you think in the comments.